One evening, as Robert De Niro walked through the lively and chaotic streets of New York, he became acutely aware of everything that had happened to him and what the path he had followed for years had brought him. He was one of Hollywood's biggest stars, a man who had inspired millions and won countless awards. But there was an inner void, a sense of loneliness that fame had only deepened. The more he achieved, the more he felt disconnected from the world around him. De Niro wanted to be seen as a human being, not just as a celebrity. The thoughts about how fame had thickened the walls around him had slowly led him to a decision: to have dinner as an ordinary customer without introducing himself, without anyone recognizing him or speaking to him. Could this truly be the only way to find out who he really was beneath the layers of stardom? He made a decision. He would put himself to the test. He would go to one of the famous restaurants he owned in New York, act as an anonymous customer, and observe how others would see him while questioning himself. In that moment, the star De Niro would disappear, and only a man would remain. And of course, this process would take him on a journey where he would learn a great lesson about identity, humility, and human connection. When De Niro stepped through the restaurant's door, no one recognized him. He had put on glasses, a hat, and a simple jacket, completely shedding his identity. The first thing he noticed upon entering was the bustling energy of the restaurant. Waiters rushed around, focused on their tasks, while the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversations filled the air. Everyone was busy with their work, but no one knew who De Niro was. He slowly moved forward, finding a table in a quiet corner where he could observe without drawing attention. As he chose his table, the waiters approached him just like any other customer. They treated him like a man who simply wanted to order a meal. This began to unsettle De Niro, but at the same time, it made him feel free. No one recognized him, no one expected anything from him. He just wanted to feel like a truly ordinary customer. Meanwhile, as the waiters were busy taking orders, De Niro began observing the surroundings with a different perspective. How were people eating? No one seemed close to each other. A couple sat in silence, scrolling through their phones. A group of friends laughed loudly, but their laughter felt hollow, as if they were trying too hard. And for a moment, he thought, do we really think it's this hard to exist as a human being? He once again reflected on how fame and success isolate a person, creating a barrier between him and the world. When De Niro called the waiter to place his order, the waiter walked over to his table without paying much attention. His name tag read Mike, and his face bore the marks of exhaustion. From behind his glasses, De Niro thought the waiter would return to take his order, but Mike barely glanced at him, scribbling something on his notepad. De Niro tried to make eye contact, hoping to remind the waiter of his presence, but the only expression on Mike's face was distraction and inner exhaustion. "What can I get you?" Mike asked, his tone flat and uninterested. De Niro hesitated for a moment, then ordered a simple dish. Mike nodded and walked away without another word. The indifference in his attitude struck De Niro deeply. He was used to being treated with reverence, but this coldness was something entirely new. A feeling of anger began to rise within him, but he also wanted to understand Mike's behavior and continue observing him. De Niro tried to understand what might be behind this attitude. At that moment, Mike's behavior seemed so simple, yet it carried a deep meaning. How we treat someone without knowing who they are changes everything. Was this how ordinary people were treated every day? The thought lingered in his mind as he sipped his water, feeling both invisible and exposed. After a while, the waiters continued chatting among themselves, none of them paying attention to De Niro. Mike was leaning against the counter, complaining to another waiter about his long shift and how he hadn't had a break all day. "I'm so done with this place," Mike muttered, rubbing his temples. Suddenly, the head waiter, a sharp-eyed man named Carlos, glanced toward De Niro's table. His eyes widened in recognition. In an instant, he realized that the man in front of him was Robert De Niro. Carlos quickly approached Mike and whispered, "Do you know who that is? That's Robert De Niro." Mike's face turned pale. He looked back at De Niro's table, his hands trembling slightly. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted instantly. The waiters, who had been indifferent moments ago, now moved with a newfound urgency. Carlos rushed to De Niro's table, his demeanor completely changed. "Mr. De Niro, I'm so sorry we didn't recognize you earlier. Is there anything we can do to make your experience better? Carlos asked, his voice filled with nervous excitement. De Niro's face showed only weariness. He had hoped to remain anonymous, but now the illusion was shattered. He looked at Carlos and then at Mike, who stood awkwardly in the background, his earlier indifference replaced by visible discomfort. Mike approached De Niro's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Mr. De Niro, I didn't realize it was you. I'm so sorry for how I acted earlier," he stammered, his voice trembling. De Niro studied Mike for a moment, noticing the exhaustion in his eyes and the faint lines of stress on his face. "Why are you sorry?" De Niro asked calmly. "Because I'm famous. What if I were just another customer? Would you still be sorry?" Mike looked down, unable to meet De Niro's gaze. I didn't mean to be rude. It's just been a long day and De Niro interrupted him gently. "I understand. We all have bad days, but how we treat people, especially when we are struggling, says a lot about who we are." The restaurant fell silent as the other waiters and customers watched the exchange. De Niro's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mike nodded slowly, his face a mixture of shame and realization. De Niro stood up, leaving enough cash on the table to cover his meal and a generous tip. He looked around the restaurant, taking in the faces of the staff and customers. For a moment, he felt the weight of his fame pressing down on him, but he also felt a strange sense of clarity. He turned to Mike and Carlos, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Fame is fleeting. What lasts is how we treat each other. Today, I wanted to be just another person, but I realized something important. It's not about who we are in the eyes of the world. It's about who we are when no one is watching." With that, De Niro walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a stunned silence. The waiters and customers exchanged glances, each person reflecting on their own behavior and attitudes. As De Niro disappeared into the New York night, the restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations. Mike sat down at an empty table, his head in his hands. Carlos placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We all make mistakes," Carlos said. "What matters is what we learn from them." De Niro's visit had left a lasting impression. The staff began to treat each other and the customers with more kindness and respect, remembering the lesson they had learned that night. Fame and power, they realized, were temporary, but the way they treated others would define them in the long run. As we conclude the story, it's important to ask questions that make the audience reflect. What lesson do you think can be drawn from De Niro's story? How well do we truly know how we treat someone without knowing who they are? How might someone like De Niro, treated as just a customer, have felt internally? And perhaps the most important question of all, in a world that often values fame and status over humanity, how can we ensure that we treat everyone with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of who they are?